Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Women in Science and Healthcare virtual event. This is our first virtual event that we host as our series network event for Women in Science. So thank you all for joining us, and we are delighted to have each one of you. I know there's so many other things that you could be participating in right now or other events, but we appreciate your time this afternoon to join us as we hear from our very special guest speaker tonight. We would like to start off with reminding everybody that if you're not on mute, to place your mics on mute. And we would also like to thank everyone, first and foremost, but also a special thank you to Health Wildcatters, Biotech at Pegasus Park, and Lida Hill Philanthropies for their continuous support. And a special thank you to Dr. Hubert Sachek and Lindsay Settles, who without them, this mission could not be brought forward as it is now. So Women in Science and Healthcare is basically a network that's designed to support women in science and healthcare who have an interest in starting an entrepreneurial venture. In prior years, we've held WISH hackathons and the Texas Great Healthcare Challenge that has brought entrepreneurship within the grasp of many entrepreneurial-minded scientists and practitioners. The WISH network is a continuation of that type of support for women who wish to launch a healthcare-related startup or a science healthcare-related startup. So here you'll see two images on the left. It was our past event with Shireen Abdullah, who is the founder of Yumlish, and she was actually one of the prior WISH hackathon participants at many years ago. And so now she has her own company and continues to give back as she spoke to our group last month. We also had Dr. Lauren Tyra at our very first event, as you'll see on the right, where she's not only an incredible community leader, but she's also a venture capitalist and scientist. So it's just great to be able to connect with amazing women and amazing individuals who are like-minded, but are also doing amazing work in the industry. And as we speak of incredible, I would like to present our very guest speaker who is incredible and is doing amazing work. She is the author of Building Backwards to Biotech, which I have my very own copy here. And really everyone should get one of these because it's incredible. And she is also the co-founder and chief business officer of Centivax. So Stephanie Wisner co-founded the biotech startup Centivax, where she is now chief business officer. She has also advised multiple biotech startups on business and commercialization strategy through her consulting business, BioVenture Advising LLC. In 2022, she was named Forbes 30 Under 30 for healthcare. She completed her MBA at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business with concentrations in finance, accounting, and entrepreneurship. She also received her bachelor's degree in chemistry and chemical biology from Cornell University and also received a research grant for her independent research on cancer. She also is the author of Building Backwards to Biotech, which has been named #1 for new release in the category of biotechnology. The book is currently taught as a biotech entrepreneurial programming at multiple institutions, including Dartmouth College, Cornell University, and others. She is currently also an entrepreneurial resident at Cornell University. While she no longer gets as much time in the lab, she enjoys the travel and continuous learning this career involves. Stephanie, first and foremost, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And we are so honored to have you as our guest speaker tonight. I'll hand it over to you because I know you have an incredible presentation for us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Let me just get the screen sharing going. Can you see that okay? Is that working? Good. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much again for having me. I'm very excited to be here speaking to all of you tonight. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit about biotech entrepreneurship, how I got into it, how you can get into it, and what best practices around it are, as taken a little bit from my book. So to start out, to tell you a little bit about how I got into biotech, I started at the bench, much like probably a lot of you. And this is a picture that was taken when I was an undergrad, but I did research at Cornell University, as well as at Pfizer for a little bit, as well as at University of Michigan. And really got to see just the power of basic science research and how The innovations that we worked on in the lab had the potential to treat disease in novel ways. And I found that super exciting, but it didn't take me very long to realize that although academia was really good at that sort of scientific innovation, it was less good, as it just simply isn't the purpose of academia, at translating some of those things we discovered from the bench to real people. And the focus of academia was much more around publishing and winning grants, which again was all good, but I was very interested in translation. So I thought to myself, well, what if I become a doctor? And it seemed to me that the fastest way to kind of test out what being a doctor was like was to go be a medical scribe. So that's what I did. And this is not a picture of me. This is a picture I found on Google Images. Nevertheless, this is what I did. So medical scribing is when you follow a physician through their various appointments, you keep their notes, and as such, you get to see all the different patient-doctor interactions. And from that, I learned two things. One, that the physician was constantly seeing patients for which we had no more medical options left to offer them. So whether it was a patient with Alzheimer's or someone with stage 4 cancer, there were constantly patients that we encountered that we ran out of medical options for them. And second, I realized that the physician was severely limited as to what she could do for patients by the medicines available to her, the medicines that existed. And so from that, I realized that there was this two-sided problem. On the one hand, there is this innovation gap. More new medicines were needed. But on the other hand, there is also a translation gap. Innovations from the lab rarely progressed out of the lab. And at this point, I'm going to take a brief break talking about my story to talk a little bit about business. So when I was a scientist in undergrad and thinking a little bit about business, I always thought that I was not interested in it at all, because to me, I thought business was about money, and I thought I'm not interested in money. What I'm interested in is science. But what I didn't realize is that the purpose of business, sure, involves money, but an effective business does not actually earn money unless it's solving real problems for real people. And startups, such as the ones you see listed on the screen, have historically been one of the best ways to solve new problems for people. So as an example, touch on Uber and Lyft for a second. Uber and Lyft are a great example of this, because before Uber and Lyft, there's this problem. People who lived in cities wanted to get from point A to point B, but it was often way too expensive to own a car, and public transit was often inefficient. On the other hand, there were people who did own cars in cities, and those cars spent a lot of time just sitting around not being used. And so, of course, the solution to that problem became ride sharing. And although getting to profitability is a different exercise, Uber and Lyft and the fact that they've been able to gain so much traction, uptake, and revenue over the years is a testament to the fact that they are solving a real problem for real people. And without that, they would not be able to earn revenue. Second, Southwest. Of course, that's a little bit closer to home with you guys in Texas, but want to make a quick point about airline business models first, which is that airlines are traditionally, to this day, considered to be one of the most difficult businesses to make work. And that's because it's really hard to make those businesses be profitable. And at the time when Southwest came about, the only airlines that existed were some of the major airlines, which today are called American, United, Delta, etc. And those airlines had a very specific business model, which was to charge a very high price point to attempt to be profitable. And as a result, the average family leisure traveler was not really able to afford to fly. Only people who were flying for business could really afford to fly at the time. And so what Southwest did is they innovated on the typical business model for airlines, because they realized that there was a problem, that these customers couldn't afford to fly. And so Southwest flew out of minor airports instead of major airports. So for example, Love Field instead of DFW in Texas. They also flew at off hours so that their rental costs for the airports were cheaper. They also did away with some amenities that at the time were thought to be essential to flying. Like they served a meal literally every time you flew. You had these giant seats. And Southwest really realized that that's actually not what people cared about. They cared about being able to afford their plane tickets if you're targeting a family leisure travel customer. And today, Southwest continues to be one of the most profitable airlines because of that. And even during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, Southwest was one of the only airlines that had an Altman Z-score, which is a measure of the likelihood of bankruptcy in the healthy range. And all of that is a testament to what happens when a business effectively solves a problem for a customer. And so likewise, I realized that entrepreneurship in science had the potential similarly to solve problems for real people in science and medicine. And that biotech, which is entrepreneurship in science and medicine, had the potential to be the bridge between the two problems I had witnessed, where on the one hand, patients needed new medicines, and on the other, there were innovations in labs that weren't actually making it to patients. And so in order to understand how powerful biotech can be, it's first important that we talk about the path of a typical drug development effort and what that entails. And so what you're seeing in front of you is the path to the development of a single new drug. And what I want you to notice is three things. Number one, this is the pathway. So first, you start out with discovery and preclinical studies. And if you're successful at that, you can go on to what's called an IND filing, which is when you put a data package together, submit it to the FDA, and gain permission to go into clinical trials. If they say yes, you can go into the next stage of clinical trials, which is a phase 1 trial. And then if you succeed at that, you can go into a phase 2 trial. If you succeed at that, you can do a phase 3 trial. And if that's successful, you can submit what's called an NDA, a new drug application, to the FDA. And only at that point, if the FDA looks at all of that data in your drug package and says, hey, it looks great, you can sell this drug now, can you finally get to the market and make your first dollar of revenue? And so point one, this is an extremely complicated path in a way that software companies or new food companies never have to experience. So point two is the high probability of failure. So if you look up here, 4%, that is the likelihood of one new molecule making it from here all the way to here where it can be sold on the market. And as you can see, there's a separate likelihood of failure at each of these steps. Third, I want you to notice the timeline at the bottom, which is that this process on average takes between 10 to 15 years. And that's on average. That's a very, very long time to make revenue, because remember, while you're doing this process, you cannot be making a single dollar. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the cost to develop one new molecule from discovery and preclinical all the way to the market costs on average $1.4 billion. And I want to point out two things about that number. Number one, that number is in 2013 dollars. And so if you account for the fact that it's 2023 today and you include inflation, that number would be much higher. Second, it doesn't include the cost of failure. So if you look at this 4% number, if you capitalize in that cost of failure, which is to say you include all the failed drugs in that 1 in 10 drugs that actually makes it to the market, that number becomes 2.6 billion, also in 2013 dollars. So again, be much higher today. And so I want you to realize from this whole thing is that if it's not obvious, making a new medicine is extremely difficult, but more so, great science is not enough to overcome the difficulties inherent to this industry and this business. And so biotech uniquely has the ability to be extremely innovative on this model and to begin to overcome some of the hurdles that we see here. So to show you that, I want to talk a little bit about one company called Genentech. So before Genentech, the lifespan of someone with diabetes was between 45 and 65 years, which is not terrible, but that is because the standard of care back then was to treat diabetes with insulin that was harvested from cow and pig pancreases. So literally you would take a cow or a pig, take out their pancreas and extract insulin. And want to point out a couple things, which is first that most importantly, diabetes without insulin is a fatal disease. So you need insulin. But the problem with getting it from cow and pig pancreases, of course, is that number one, it's expensive and not readily available because your supplies are limited. There's inconsistency in the batches between one pancreas to another. And perhaps most importantly, there is a fairly high risk of an immunogenicity reaction because, of course, your body is not made to process cow and pig proteins. And enter Genentech. Genentech's widely thought of as the first biotech company. They came to be in 1976, and they decided to come at this problem where insulin was very limited in supply, inconsistent, and had the risk of immunogenicity reactions. And they took this technology called recombinant DNA technology. So think restriction enzymes. You've probably been hearing about them since high school. But at the time, this technology was only used in the lab. And it was even thought at the time that probably E. coli couldn't even express human proteins because human proteins were so much higher evolutionarily in the tree than E. coli. And so there's a lot of disbelief that you could even get a bacteria to produce a working human protein. And so Genentech took this technology out of the lab from universities such as Stanford and UCSF, spun it into a new company called Genentech, and within 5 years, they received FDA approval for its first drug, human insulin, which they called Humulin. And what I want to point out about that is a few things. Number one, this process only took about 5 years. Compare that to the previous slide where we saw that this process takes on average between 10 to 15 years. Second, while we don't know exactly how much they spent to do this process, it's reasonable to assume that if you create a drug in 5 years, it's probably going to cost less than if you create it in 10 to 15 years. And third, and perhaps most importantly, Genentech totally revolutionized diabetes treatment. Not only was there now consistency in quality and potency across batches, and insulin was available in unlimited supply virtually, today, diabetes patients have the same expected lifespan as a non-diabetes patient. And that is in large part thanks to Genentech and their innovation. And this is just one example of how biotech can be an efficient and innovative way to translate new things from the lab and to patients. So to return to my story for a second, I know Javelin touched on many of these things at the beginning, but after I decided that entrepreneurship was an interesting path, I ended up going to business school. So I got my MBA from University of Chicago. I worked for a couple years at a biotech venture capital firm called Arch Venture Partners, who they're extremely well known for many of their companies, but one of them, Illumina, revolutionized the cost and efficiency of DNA sequencing. And that was a company that Arch started, made the founding investment in. And nowadays, I'm at Sensivax full-time, where I'm the chief business officer. I also wrote a book, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, and was named to the Forbes 30 under 30 list for healthcare. So to talk a little bit more about Sensivax, our tagline is Smash the Mutants. And the problem that we're solving, because if you recall, I said all good businesses, including biotech, solve problems. The problem that we're solving is that mutating viruses cause our vaccines to fail. And of course, we've seen this very clearly with COVID, which is that with our vaccines, we're constantly chasing the next variant. And try as we might, the virus mutates faster than we can create a vaccine to address it. And this has been a problem historically for influenza. Most pandemics before COVID were influenza-based. And this is a chart that we're looking at of the antigen drift and shift of influenza antigens over time. And as you can see, shifted a lot. The other problem, of course, with flu, which many of you guys are probably all too familiar with, is that vaccines are unpredictably matched to seasonal strains. There's no way to know what the predominant strain of flu will be. Thus, each season, a vaccine manufacturer is left guessing based on WHO and FDA's guidance what the major strain of interest will be. But because they're doing it ahead of time, the efficacy rate is so low. So as you can see, On average, the efficacy rate hovers somewhere around 30%. Our product will probably be around 90%. So our product, our future product, and our solution to that problem is a broad spectrum, universal vaccine to address all future strains of flu. I'm happy to talk about the scientific backing of that more in the Q&A section. But to tell you more about our business, we raised $10 million in a seed round in October and are currently finalizing our vaccine formulation for clinical trials. So let's talk about my book for a second. So first, why did I write it? And that's for two reasons. The first is that I wanted to know what made scientific entrepreneurs successful. In an industry so rife with failure, what distinguished the winners from the losers? Second, I believe that scientists should be empowered to understand business. You guys, as the scientists and doctors of the future, are the ones who actually understand the tech. And therefore, you are uniquely enabled to guide a business. But you can't do that if you don't understand business. And so I wanted to write the book that I wanted when I was getting into the industry, because that is how we're going to have the next generation of new medicines, is because people like you are going to invent them and you're going to bring them to people through starting biotech companies of your own. And so I hope my book can be a guide for you guys in how to do that. And so just to talk a little bit more about that. So in the course of many, many hours of interviewing people, this theme began to emerge of what distinguished biotech success from a biotech failure, which is this idea of building backwards. And building backwards is simply building with the end in mind, defining your end goal early on, which enables you to more easily optimize your path to success. Now, I know, as most of you are scientists, you're probably thinking, this sounds like a vast oversimplification because science rarely behaves the way we predict. However, I want to point out that this is not a step-by-step protocol to put into practice, but rather a method of thinking, which is adaptable to any unforeseen scientific complication. Furthermore, building backwards is a simple concept, and yet it's so easy to botch. Particularly in biotech, it becomes especially challenging not to lose sight of a larger goal as a scientific entrepreneur struggles with the also challenging and very important immediate goals that are common to an area as exacting and detail-oriented as science. So in biotech then, building backwards is particularly important to constantly ponder to spur constant refocusing on the end goal. We're going to talk about how that works and why it can be so powerful. So I want to tell you a little bit about Synovion. So Synovion is a Japanese biotechnology company that built backwards towards the end goal of getting a new schizophrenia medicine approved efficiently. So for those of you who aren't familiar with schizophrenia, clinical schizophrenia is a medically assessed syndrome according to two sets of symptoms: positive, which are hallucinations or movement disorders, or negative symptoms, or in addition to negative symptoms as well, which include loss of motivation or pleasure. And the theory for this is that this disease is driven by dopaminergic dysregulation, and that's what drives the disease. Existing schizophrenia drugs work by blocking this dopamine receptor D2 as its primary target, which of course makes sense given the fact that schizophrenia is believed to be caused by dopamine dysregulation. And this figure over here that you see shows all the existing schizophrenia drugs. And as you can see, all of them target this D2 receptor. So the problem with this is twofold. While these drugs that exist for schizophrenia are effective in alleviating the positive symptoms, they're incompletely effective in alleviating the negative symptoms. Furthermore, blocking these D2 receptors comes with a host of negative side effects, such as weight gain and other metabolic problems. Thus, Synovion saw a problem. Just like we said before, good businesses start with problems, and this problem was twofold. Number one, the market and patients needed a medicine that treated negative symptoms. And second, they needed a medicine that didn't have the negative side effects associated with blocking the D2 receptors. So Synovion built backwards. They defined their end goal which was identifying a schizophrenia drug candidate with an effect on both positive and negative symptoms that did not bind the D2 receptor. So how did they do that? They used a novel drug screening method, which was an artificial intelligence technology, and they used that to analyze the behavior of mice. And they exposed the mice to hundreds, if not thousands, of candidate compounds. Then they did an in vitro screen to select one of those candidate compounds that did not bind the D2 receptors. And I want to point out here that typically in drug development, you start with the in vitro screen, which is to see which receptor your potential medicine is modulating. And then second, you go into in vivo. And there's a huge failure rate between those two things because, as I'm sure all of you are all too familiar with, the small molecules that work really well in a test tube or a petri dish often do not work in animals. And so this was a situation in which they were able to increase the probability of in vivo success by starting with their in vivo assay and then filtering for the target. And long story short, what happened is that they were able to get this compound, which they named ulotaront. Today, ulotaront is currently in phase 3, and it's demonstrated clinically in its phase 2 trial that it has a significant improvement in negative symptoms compared to placebo. It also has lower rates of side effects as compared to the currently approved drugs which target D2. And although you never truly know with science, Synovion was able to increase the probability of this occurring by selecting for this in their experiments early on. Additionally, when there is a good market there because the science is strong and good businesses, remember, solve problems, a business was very interested in the problem that Synovion was solving. And so Otsuka Pharmaceutical paid nearly $890 million for the rights to co-develop this molecule. Although this drug has yet to complete its phase 3 trial and receive approval, Synovion is well on its way to achieving differentiation in the schizophrenia market and has made significant strides to improve the quality of schizophrenia treatment. How do they do this? By building backwards from their targeted market positioning. So I want to point out that, of course, this assay that they use with mice is not going to be applicable to most, if not any other drug development efforts for other indications. The point is, by building backwards and by defining the important questions to ask early on, Synovion was able to use innovative new research approaches and to use those things early on to increase their probability of success later. So I have lots of other things that I can talk about in terms of the book if you guys are interested, but for now, I'll move it over to Q&A. Thank you so much for having me come and speak. This is the book. It's available on Amazon if you're interested. And at this point, I'd love to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Stephanie. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to place a little emoji here for a round of applause. I think I learned so much, not only about building with the end in mind, but also a good business is one that solves a problem and starts with a problem. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them on the chat. But I was just so amazed of all of the work and all of the case studies that you do in your book. I know one of them for me that was really impactful was the Nivian one. There was like a pathway with HippoYap, and they were trying to do drug development for this pathway that would help with effective cancer treatments. And so I think in your book, you kind of show how after $100 million of investment, years of clinical studies, and a lot of hard work, they decided to have a no-go towards this investment or this company, as they noticed that the patients, what really mattered to them was the seeing their loved ones feel better and not just the scientific aspect. So feel free to clear that up. But for me, that was very impactful because it shows that not only at the very beginning can a company fail, but even in late stages like Nivian, who had almost $100 million in investment, they decided to no longer continue going with their business. So I think for me, that was an incredible just insight into this industry.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for reading and for asking a very specific question. I definitely really appreciate it. Yeah, so I'll just comment on that, which is to say that the story of Nivian is really about what I think is very strange in most academic circles, which is that in biotech, failing fast is good, which sounds crazy. Why is it good? It's because it means you're failing more cheaply. Like, sure, you've invested a certain amount of effort into the company already. You've assembled a team together, you've put effort in, but what it means is you're building backwards to ask the questions early on in the company's life that, if untrue, prove your scientific hypothesis that the company is built upon as false. And you might be asking, why in the world would you want to do that? And the reason is because you want a medicine that's ultimately going to succeed in the clinic, and it's ultimately going to have a market because patients actually want to use it. If your drug makes a negligible impact for a patient, such as what Nivian ultimately found, you ultimately don't want to develop that drug, even if you can, because your investment might not actually get met with a return, because you are not actually solving a problem for patients. You're not actually helping them. And the money that you're investing to further develop this drug could actually be better spent in an indication or with a new medicine or a new concept that was more promising. And so it's actually, unlike in academia, considered a really good thing to kill projects quickly and to prove that a scientific hypothesis isn't one that's worth investing more money and time in and going down that road. And so I think in academia, sometimes there's this culture where we're afraid to ask questions that could disprove our hypotheses because you can't publish negative data, and who wants your entire PhD thesis and years of work to be like disproven? But I think that is a really good practice that we have in biotech, being willing to build backwards to ask those questions early on so that you don't kill the company later when you're 5 years in. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a really, really crucial difference for those of you who are interested in going into biotech and industry, is starting to think like that.
Yes, thank you for that insight. And I do believe we have a question here from Leslie, and it says, how frequently do new companies pull back and not go to the full mile and go to market?
By pull back, do you mean decide not to go to market because the drug isn't good enough, or not look good in clinical trials?
Leslie, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, awesome.
Hi. Sorry, I can't get my camera to work today, so I'm sorry I'm not using the camera. But either or, actually, Stephanie. So, you know, is it really frequent? You talked about failing quickly and frequently. So, do you see a lot of frequency in which something doesn't go forward, and you just abandon the idea?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Of course, as we saw in that chart that I presented early, a lot of companies fail whether or not they're trying to fail quickly. So it's a little difficult to tease out that number and see, hey, how much of this is you guys just asking good questions early on? And how much of this is, you know, putting the blinders on and then failing in a phase 3? Because that's one of the worst things you can do, is spending a decade in clinical trials and failing at a phase 3. And that's why you see companies such as Biogen pushing so hard to get their Alzheimer's drug approved at the phase 3, because it's so painful at that point to not develop a drug that you've been putting all this money into and time and development for years and years and years. So it's a little hard to tease out an exact number, but at least in biotech, which is different than pharma for my purposes here, so Biogen would be pharma, I would say that a lot of biotech companies are pushed very hard by their investors to ask these hypotheses, exploding questions very early, sometimes even before an investor is willing to give you money. And part of the reason for that is because biotech companies actually are valued steeply by which phase you're at in the process. And your valuation as a company goes up the higher your value is, like, so how much data you have, but also how you decrease risk in the company. And so when you ask a big question that could unravel your whole hypothesis and you succeed, that pushes up your value. So there's also kind of an upside to doing that as well. So again, it's a little hard to tease out numbers, but I see a lot of that in biotech specifically because investors are understandably risk adverse. And so there's pressures in that ecosystem that there just are not in pharma.
Oh, thank you.
See some other questions in the chat actually, but I'll let you guide it, Javelin.
Yes, I think one of the next ones was, how do you see the recent SVB banking crisis impacting biotech startups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very timely. So I think that it's really hard to know exactly how it'll impact biotech companies this soon, but it certainly will impact us. And the reason is SVB was a really cheap cost of capital for biotech companies in the ecosystem to get loans. It was a really big partner in the ecosystem. And because biotech companies don't have tangible assets, it's very, very hard to get loans. It's hard to get too much from a bank. And so my company was not banking with SVB. We were not exposed at all, but a lot of investors even were. And so while the Treasury decided to cover all the money that was there, so I think thankfully that stamps out the worst of the issue, which is that maybe some companies wouldn't be able to get their money back, which of course could result in decreased investment in the space, et cetera, because investors didn't have their funds. Seems like that part will probably be fine. But I think long term, there's probably going to be some differences in how quickly and efficiently biotechs can grow because they're not going to have access to some of the loans that they had previously through SVB. So I think that is significant. The other perhaps less interesting but still relevant way that it impacts us is now investors are really worried about how you are strategically spreading your money around to be kind of closer to those FDIC limits. So the FDIC limit is $250,000. And if you're above that, you're not insured above $250,000. So the solution has been for a lot of companies to spread out $250,000 across many banks so that you are insured individually at multiple banks. So it just makes it like a little annoying to manage, but I'm not sure that there is long-term implications of that. But thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you, Daria, and thank you, Stephanie. We have another one from Stella, and she says, can you comment more on your view of the difference of biotech versus pharma?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a whole chapter on this in the book if you're interested, but in short, and this is again painting with very broad strokes. So this is not every pharma company or every biotech company by any means, but in general, the way to think about it is a pharma company tends to be really good at the process because the drug development process is going to be the same for any new molecule, whether you're a biotech company or a pharma company. And biotech companies, much like any other startup, tend to be good at innovation. And so if you look at this chart again, what I mean by that is a biotech company, like let's take Genentech, for example, they come up with this really cool way to create human insulin that didn't exist before. That's the innovation, right? What they're less good at is running a phase 3 clinical trial. It takes thousands of people. It's very capital intensive. It's highly regulated. There's so many specialists that need to know how to do that. And I guess in the case of Genentech, it was a little different, but generally speaking, there's also a very high amount of expertise and resources that come in to manufacturing a drug for clinical trials. They're called GMP regulations, which is to say you can't just feed your new drug to a person in a clinical trial that you synthesize in the back of your lab. There's like some regulations around that. And it's very expensive, it's very cumbersome, and it's very hard for a very small company to do that. But a company like Pfizer or Merck or J&J that has done this for many years, they're experts at that process. And so the way to think about it is biotechs are generally more innovative and more nimble, and they do, kind of this part of the process. They do the early stages, which is the innovation, and a phase 1 trial, it's smaller. Usually you can do that yourself. You might even do a phase 2 or 3 if you have to, but generally speaking, you want to get acquired or partnered with a pharma company for this part of it because they're going to have the expertise. And frankly, I think we all know how good pharma is at marketing drugs. we can comment, this is not to comment on the ethics of that, but the fact remains that your investors are going to want your drugs to actually sell. And the best ones to get those drugs to sell are pharma companies, because they're the ones with relationships to physicians. They're the ones with the sales channels. They're the ones who can afford to pay for a Super Bowl commercial. So a lot of times the way to think about it is just that a pharma has expertise, financial resources, and they're risk adverse. So they want to take the early innovation that biotech companies have de-risked for them, and then they want to develop them and make most of the revenue year over year by marketing, selling, producing, etc., which is also good for a biotech company because a biotech company doesn't have the resources. Biotech company strong advantage is the innovation and the experts on that novel innovation. So hope that helps. More in my book if you want to hear more about that.
And she says, what is the reference for your drug development charts?
So the primary reference is a paper written by Tufts in 2013. I can't remember the exact title right now, but it's a pretty famous study. Actually, it was 2016. It's written by Damasi and it was published in the Journal of Health Economics, but there's also a couple other numbers I use. If you are very interested, those references are in the book and can be seen there, but most of these numbers come from that study.
Thank you. We have one more question. It says, is there something biotech startups should be doing to make themselves more attractive to investors in this market climate?
Yeah, absolutely. So honestly, one of the biggest things you can do is not start a company that no one wants to fund in the first place. And perhaps that's a little discouraging if you guys are already grinding away at a company, but something I'd love to leave you with is just how to think about applying building backwards to your business and how to think about starting a company of your own. And that's one of the biggest ways that you'll guarantee that you get funded is by starting a company that's going to be good in this market and in others. So one of those things is the end market size and market landscape. If you are starting a business that is like a component of another business, so for example, drug delivery companies are really tough for this reason, is that the final end market size is not actually big enough. And a lot of times people in drug delivery companies make this mistake because they're sizing the market based on, oh, cancer is a huge market. Look at how big the cancer market is. But that's not actually true because you're not developing the drug. You're just developing the delivery method for the drug, which is only a margin of that final market size. Yet it costs almost the same amount to go through the FDA clinical trials with that new thing. And so a pharma company is really not super incentivized to spend their capital developing that because there's an opportunity cost to doing that over let's say, a new asthma drug or something that can be chronically taken every day and owns the whole market. So that's a huge one to think about. Second is differentiated. I think in science, we're always thinking any progress is great progress, which is true. That is very much true in academia. That's very much true for patients in the world, but that doesn't mean that every innovation makes a good business. And so you want whatever technology you're developing to be better on 10x figures of merit, 2 figures of merit. So what I mean by that is it can't just be cheaper. It has to be 10 times cheaper. And it can't just be 10 times cheaper. It also has to be 10 times better and also 10 times cheaper. It has to be at least 2 figures of merit and then 10 times better in both. Think about Illumina, for example. That's why it was such a successful company. It wasn't just a marginal improvement in the way we did DNA sequencing. It was a, 1,000-fold improvement, basically. And then third, strategic science. Again, I think scientists have a tendency, understandably, to think about the experiments they run in a business as very similar to academia, where if your figure doesn't look perfect the first time, you want to just keep running the experiment until your figure looks good. That just doesn't work in business because you have limited capital. And with that limited capital, you have to come back with a compelling set of data that is de-risking your business by answering some of the riskiest questions for investors. So that's the whole fail fast idea. You have to be strategically thinking about each experimental question you ask and what the value of the answer is. And moreover, if the answer to your experiment is no, did you design the experiment in such a way that you believe that no? That's a really important thing too. So you're not wasting money. Fourth, team. Team is a little bit of a fluffy one, but it's very important. And investors really look for someone who has done it before. So ideally, you want to find someone who's previously been an entrepreneur and has done it successfully, whether they're on the business side or the science side. Having that person in your company is really important, or being an advisor. That person is hard to find, but that is kind of the gold standard. Additionally, if you're a PhD or a med student, it's really important / helpful to have kind of the luminary in the company. So even if the science is kind of your idea, having your PI involved as the luminary is a really big deal, because it lends credibility, and you really want to start a company with a PI who's considered a luminary in his field. That's another one. Lastly, IP. You are dead in the water without IP. Your business could be the most innovative, best thing since sliced bread, and you will never get funded unless you have intellectual property. And what's really hard for some academics to understand about IP is that you cannot publish, talk about, or even tweet about your data until you've filed a provisional patent. And if you don't do that, if you talk about it, tweet, whatever, present at a conference first, then that information is now in the public domain and it's ineligible for a patent. This can sometimes feel very weird for academics who hear me say that and think that I'm saying don't have open discourse in academia. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is be strategic about it. And what that means is before you go to the conference, send your abstract into the tech transfer office so that you can file it as a provisional patent. It doesn't need to issue before you talk about it. You just have to file. And so I'm not saying don't share. I'm saying file before you share. So in short, I think those are probably the best ways to ensure that you have a business that's investable. And the key mistake that people make is not actually after the business is started. It's about which business they start in the first place. And if you have any questions or want to get in touch, Jovelyn can attest to the fact that I'm a very slow emailer, but I do get back to you, and my email is right there. So happy to take more questions.
Yes, she will, and she's incredible. I'm just going to say that. So I do have 2 more quick fire questions for you. And one is, as an accomplished co-founder, innovator, and leader in biotech, what overall advice do you have for women who are in the middle of their journeys or who are wanting to start their entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a bit of a general piece of advice, but I think sometimes as women, we get in our own way. Like, sexism is certainly out there, but I think sometimes if we focus so much on it to the point where we're always looking for ways in which we're slighted, we're actually not using our natural feminine strengths, because we do have things that women tend to be better at than men. So for example, emotional intelligence things, I am a better manager because I'm able to, keep tabs on my employees and be emotionally intelligent about that. I'm a better negotiator because of that. And so as women, if we focus so hard on the ways in which we're slighted, it's sometimes easy to miss the ways in which we're actually often naturally at an advantage to men. And that's something I would really encourage you all to think about and to develop in yourselves. Additionally, I think just in general, as scientists interested in entrepreneurship, getting better at speaking and communicating is huge. So even though it doesn't seem like the soft skills are really that important in science, they are really what distinguish you in the workforce. You can be the best scientist ever. And even if all you want to do is be a scientist in industry, you will do so much better if you're a good communicator and you're good with people. And learning how to develop those abilities is really important. And so I'm a big proponent for mentors, finding people who are further along than you, especially people that are much, much older than you. Even if they're not in biotech, they can be extremely helpful with things. So for example, one of my biggest mentors is my aunt. She's, in her mid 60s. She was at GM. She's just totally a business person, doesn't have a science background, but she has been incredibly helpful for me navigating various professional situations and career transitions. And her mentorship, being able to call her up when I have a problem at work, that's huge. Additionally, unfortunately, sometimes women are very catty with each other. And so not all women are advocates. And so finding women and men that are willing to be career advocates for you and go the extra mile to help you, to pour into you, all of that is extremely, extremely important and valuable. And lastly, I would just say, thinking of ways to distinguish yourself. So as PhDs and MDs, you guys are probably really used to having a path set out before you. First you do your undergrad, then you do your PhD, then you do your postdoc, then you know, go do your like adjunct professorship or whatever, your assistant professorship, and then maybe you can get a tenure position. And it's a very long path. And that's all well and good, nothing against that. But in my experience, what some of the things that have been the most impactful for me professionally have been the moments in which I was willing to stray from a traditional path. So for example, I started a biotech consulting business when I was in my early 20s. And that wasn't my primary focus at first, but then it became it. And at first that kind of looked like a crazy thing for me to do. I was so young and frankly inexperienced, and I knew that at the time, but I was still had something to contribute to these companies, and I had a lot to learn. And because I was in the industry at that young age with my hands on lots of companies, being very involved in seeing all parts of a company, I knew a lot more, you know, in my late 20s than someone who was just entering the industry from perhaps a more conventional sort of pathway. So I'm not suggesting you all quit your jobs and become consultants. What I'm saying is that something where you are strategically going towards where you want to go in a way that is not the beaten path, a lot of times that can be extremely powerful.
Wow, those are great takeaways. I'm writing all of these down, but thank you for sharing that. And one last quick fire one, because we're almost at time, but how do you stay on top of industry trends, or what is one of your favorite ways to do so?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of my good friends, actually, he's the co-founder and previous CEO of Nivian, the company you brought up before, but he wrote this article that went viral on Medium called How to Learn Biotech. His name's Nathaniel Brooks Horowitz. It'll come up if you Google it. And he has a great gamut of resources there. So if you guys are interested in the industry, there's daily, weekly publications and podcasts you can listen to. I have a mailing list that I barely ever use, but it's on my personal website, and keep you guys posted on anything that I do.
Wonderful. And we subscribe to your list through bioventureadvising.com, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Stephanie. I feel like you shared so many golden nuggets of knowledge, of just insight, and just your experience is really inspiring. And I hope everyone that was on the call as well felt inspired. And just hearing all of the great knowledge and wisdom that you brought to us this evening. But before we go, I do want to, and Lindsay, throughout this whole time, we've been keeping tabs of who's been on the call. So we are actually going to do a quick raffle for 2 winners of Building Backwards to Biotech. So drum roll.
All right, here we go. So our first winner is Aruna. If you are, yep, you're still on here. So Aruna, you have won one of the books. So if you don't mind just putting your email address in the chat, and I will reach out to you directly to find a good address to send that to. And
Thank you. That's really great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And number 2, here we go, is Stella Robertson. So Stella, same thing. If you could put your email in the chat, I will reach out to find a good address for you. And congratulations to both of you.
Congratulations. So yes, please put your email on the chat so that we can take it before we end. But last but not least, I would like to invite you all to join our Wish Network LinkedIn group, which is a private group where we post different events, but we also post different information and resources, along with mentors who are open to giving mentoring. So it's a growing community that if you'd like to join, I know Lindsay placed the link at the very top. But also you can follow us on our social networks at Wish Network _ at Wish Network _ for Twitter. And then also you can subscribe to our newsletter at www.wishnetwork.com. So we would like to thank each one of you again. Thank you, Stephanie, for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. And just
thank you all for coming.
Thank you for coming. And we will see you soon at our next event, which is to be determined.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.